Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel. I am Dr. Seth Meyer. I will be the moderator, and I am very excited to be part of this. We have three not just really interesting panels about LGBTQ issues, but presenting LGBTQ issues in really diverse areas. From art to education to nonprofits. So I think this will really lead to a fascinating discussion on public administration and social equity around LGBTQIA issues. We will do each of the three presentations, and then at the end of each presentation, and I think they're all about 10 minutes each, we will have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to that you're just thinking of course, or you don't want to ask, you can always just put them in the chat. And when we do questions, just feel free to do the raise your hand or put the question in the chat. So the first person who's going to go is Ignacio. Please take it away.
Hi. Do you want me to go through the presentation already, or should I just introduce myself?
You can pull up the presentation. You should be able to screen share.
Yeah, so let me do that. So hopefully you see that on screen.
Looks good.
Good. So you see the title card, I assume.
Yeah.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Ignacio of Darnaude, and I'm really grateful to the University of San Francisco for giving me the opportunity to participate in the Social Equity Leadership Conference. And to give you a little bit of a sense of my background, I've been in the film business for over 2 decades, and I left my positions as head of international marketing for Disney and then for Sony to develop a documentary series called Hiding in Plain Sight, Breaking the Queer Code in Art. And in the process, and based on 10 years of research on the subject, I'm now giving lectures in universities, LGBTQ centers, and via Zoom around the world on how, in spite of enormous repression, queer artists have revolutionized mainstream culture throughout history. And today, my lecture called Don't Say Gay, the Erasure of Queerness in Art, is about how, in spite of the huge impact of a queer artist, museums and the art world have historically erased their queerness, shattering any sense of cultural equity. So I want to start with a quick caveat. I'm going to be using the term queer instead of gay throughout the presentation. And the word queer, which was used as an insult against the LGBTQ community, while it's still not widely used in, for instance, in communities of color, lately it has been reappropriated by a broad section of the LGBTQ community as a proud defiance of heteronormativity. And I think this quote from the artist Larry Clark really summarizes it beautifully. He says, "Gay implies weak, fey. Queer is transgressive, audacious, and apologetic. Queer doesn't have a look, a gender. It defies boundaries. It absorbs and appreciates gay, and it doesn't care who you sleep with." But before I talk about social equity, I want to mention how, as the queer artist Nathan Blake indicates, the queer community is the only minority for what we do, not for who we are. Queer is the only culture and identity that is not transmitted through family. In fact, it contradicts family identity. That's why the history of queer art is very fragile. It's not meant to be written. But what is fascinating is that in spite of this, enormous challenge, a fact that is never taught in schools is that far from irrelevant, invisible, or just a new trend, queer art has appeared in every culture and in all media, crossing through all genders, races, and beliefs, from, as you can see here, from Egyptian tombs to Greek vases, Renaissance sculptures, and modern day photography. Not only that, many of the world's most valuable paintings have been created by queer artists, including the recent example of Marilyn Monroe's painting by Andy Warhol that sold for $195 million. However, when you ask people, the vast majority of the population cannot name any queer artists. Why is this? So I'm going to explain the reasons for this lack of awareness. So the history of queer art is intimately linked to the shifting perception of homosexuality through the ages. In ancient Greece, as you can see here, the relationship between an older man with a young man was an integral part of the young man's education to instill courage and honor in them. But it all changed with the advent of Christianity in the 4th century. When male homosexual acts were punished with death penalty, female homosexuality was not even considered. It was unfathomable. So these laws obviously had a seismic impact on art, with, for instance, erotic art disappearing completely. So from that moment on, queer artists face a dilemma: hide their sexuality or be out with their art and their lives, and in doing so, face prosecution from severe laws that were not repealed in many countries until recent times. I mean, you may not know this, but this is still an issue. Homosexuality was not decriminalized in the UK until 1967, and 71 countries still criminalize homosexuality today. But in my research, I uncovered how, in spite of this repression, queer artists have revolutionized art, survived scandals, won landmark battles, and transformed mainstream culture from the Renaissance, like you see here, Michelangelo, to modern times with the iconic American Gothic created by the queer artist Grant Wood. I love this quote from the author Camille Paglia. She says, "For 2,500 years, Western culture has fed itself on the achievements of a small bands of queer artists attaining visionary heights through defiance of the established code of beauty." And one example that is rarely discussed is that the pop movement, for instance, was created mostly by queer artists, such as Hockney, Warhol, Keith Haring, Jasper Jones, artists who rejected society norms, such as hypermasculinity and heteronormativity. But for centuries, museums have held double standards in regards to how they discuss artist sexuality. When artists are heterosexual, like Picasso, we know everything about his female muses. However, up until very recently, when you bring up the sexuality of queer artists, the response from the conservative museum boards that are afraid of losing prestige or funding is usually, "Oh, that is irrelevant." And this don't ask, don't tell policy forces many curators to hide same-sex relationships from artists and closet admire queer figures, while conveniently they out disliked queer figures such as Caligula. So one of the many examples is the 7-year relationship between Jasper Jones and Robert Rauschenberg, which was crucial for the development as artists, but it hasn't been discussed openly until last year's Jasper Jones retrospective, 2021. And 3 years earlier, the Rauschenberg retrospective at MoMA described their life-changing relationship as an intense friendship. And instead, they focused on Rauschenberg's child from a brief relationship with a woman. The art critic of the Washington Post, Philip Kennicott, says it very well. The art world needs to confront a long record of hiding the outstanding contribution of queer artists, keeping them in the closet. And the queer artist David Wojnarowicz said, "Major museums make invisible any sexual images besides straight, white, male fantasies." As I'm going to show you in the next few slides, museums have purposely erased, stigmatized, censored, and pigeonholed the work of queer artists, provoking a nearly universal lack of awareness of queer artists and a glaring lack of social and cultural equity. For instance, in many cases, museums erase queer work from their exhibitions. The first Andy Warhol retrospective at MoMA in 1989 excluded his groundbreaking queer work, here's an example, as if it had been done by a different artist. The art world also stigmatizes queer artists. The 1999 Whitney exhibition, The American Century, avoided all references to queer artists except for AIDS, turning all queer artists invisible or into victims. And museums censor queer artists. The Robert Mapplethorpe 1989 exhibition was confiscated at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington when Jesse Helms succeeded in equating the terms art equal queer equal AIDS. And the art establishment barely resisted these anti-queer dictates. After this exhibition, there were no mainstream museum exhibitions about queer art in the United States for over 2 decades. So this erasure has a costly aftermath for queer artists. Up until very recently, many artists rejected the queer label because it could displace any other factor of their work, affect their reputation, critics' reaction, and even the price of their work. For instance, when Warhol's queer drawings got rejected, concerned that they would stop him from becoming a famous artist, Warhol transformed his art into pop and his image becoming more androgynous than queer. And during the AIDS era, collectors stayed away from queer artists such as Robert Mapplethorpe because they thought these artists wouldn't live long enough to make a significant cultural impact, and consequently, they wouldn't return their market value. So now, concentrating on social equity. Social equity has a crucial importance for queer artists. For starters, when we raise the relevance of an artist's homosexuality in their creativity and the crucial impact of queer artists in art history, we are reinforcing the lack of representation, visibility, and social equity of the queer community. The queer activist Larry Kramer said, "You are not a community until you have a history." And now specifically about art, art has a crucial role in social equity. Andre Gide said, "Art is a silver bullet against sexism, intolerance, and hatred. It engenders empathy." And queer art has a key role in nurturing self-awareness and confidence in queers. In essence, you can't be it until you see it. Matthew Lopez, the author of the Tony-winning play, The Inheritance, said it beautifully. "Knowing that I'm part of a continuum of queer artists, people who have felt as I have felt, has consoled me more than anything ever has." And up until very recent times, the majority of bodies represented in paintings have been either the ruling class or those who could afford to commission artworks. A new generation of queer artists such as Kehinde Wiley, Christina Quirles, and Doron Landberg are defying the norm, depicting themselves and their loved ones, asserting the value of the queer experience. But Doron Landberg warns us about how, in art, depictions of heterosexual desire can represent war, peace, God, anything you want. But when a queer artist represents desire, the work is immediately pigeonholed to being only about sex. The erotic images constructed by queer males can only be pornographic to straight eyes, he says. Things started changing in 2017 with a blockbuster exhibition at Tate's museum called Queer British Art. And since then, museums are finally beginning to acknowledge the queer heritage in their collections. But as you know, things are changing, with politics turning against the cultural equity of queer rights once again. So part of our social equity leadership should be to ensure that everyone should have, as a basic human right, access to arts which reflect individual identities, affirm personal value, and foster belonging in the community. The 2018 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights noted that cities that adopt cultural equity enhance inclusion, engagement, and diversity, and contribute to positive outcomes across civic life. So for those in the audience to implement this resolution, I encourage cities to advocate for equitable representation and resources to support and serve diverse populations, acknowledge past exclusions and change perception by encouraging the participation of artists from groups who have experienced prejudice in the past, and address any implicit biases that may lead to preferences for one artist or art form over another. And just to finish my presentation, I want to talk about how here in California, we have a great weapon for cultural equity that we should take advantage of. It's called the California's Fair Education Act, which was signed into law in 2011, and it amends the California Education Code to include the fair, accurate, inclusive, and respectful reference to contributions by members of the LGBTQ community industry and in social studies curriculum. And it's been proven that the proper implementation of this law decreases bullying, and it improves morale, safety, and student engagement in campus, empowering future queer generations, which is what we all want. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Great, thank you so much. And now it's on to me. I am using a new computer and I seem to be having some issues. Let me just, you know what, Elvis, why don't you take, and you'll have 15 minutes and then I will go after, because I am trying to get this to work on my new computer. So Elvis.
Sounds good. I was going to say I can share your slides, Seth, if you wanted to go next. So
you know what, you go and I'll just have to just step out and step back in. So I'll miss like 2 seconds of your presentation, but
No
go ahead. 15 minutes for you now.
Perfect. Okay, well, give me a second. Hi, everyone. My name is Elvis Bakaitis. Happy to be here today. I'm going to share my screen. So give me 1 second to pull up my slides. Great, and I might go a little short. I usually do. So just to introduce myself and situate, and we're going to kind of shift gears completely away from art, which obviously I have a lot of opinions about. Definitely appreciate the presentation. But yeah, so right now we're talking about preferred names and gender as that issue manifests across higher education, but specifically at the City of University of New York, which is where I work. So I work in the library, but I became deeply involved with this issue. So let's talk about what that means. And I know a lot of folks are from the West Coast, so maybe you are ahead of us with this, but just for a quick review. So preferred names are basically, it's just any name you go by that's not your legal first name. So in terms of higher ed, this can manifest on your ID card, on your email address, on your diploma, myriad other ways. Preferred names are not specific or unique to LGBTQ people. So many people, for cultural reasons, they get married, they change their name by a nickname, a million reasons why you might have a different name. But in this case, we are talking about it from like a very specific angle, because for trans and gender nonconforming students, this issue really shapes their college experience. So just to give us a little sense of that. So why does this issue seem brand new? So a lot of trans issues are typically contextualized as being quote unquote new. However, this is really because people refused to document at all. So prior to 2015, that was the first large-scale national survey documenting trans adults in the United States. Prior to that, in terms of demographics, it was considered offensive to ask people about their gender identity, even though it had been raised many times. So it's not like in 2014, they were like, oh yeah, it'd be a good idea to do this. It's like, no, we've been pretty much resisting it for years. Similarly, what's interesting is that queer identity is often not included in student demographics. So you get a really distorted picture of who students are. And within higher ed, that becomes very critical, because if you don't know who students are, you can't get grants, you can't serve them. They become an invisible population. So this is going to get a little New York City specific, but I think it's a good case study. So in 2002, the city council tried to pass some legislation, and I put a little excerpt here from the Associated Press, which has some pretty outdated terminology. But I think what it highlights is the resistance to including anything that involves quote unquote cross-gender identification. So that has really been pushed back at specifically. And that, as we perhaps all know in this room, is a really big trend in terms of the LGBTQ activism over time. In the late 90s, you kind of start to see a little bit of change. But queer students are already impacted by so many different issues. So preferred name is like the drop in a bucket. There's homelessness, bullying in schools, and a lot of this is really exacerbated, again, by these, I would call it a microaggression or just aggression of the institution not really recognizing their name or their gender. So in terms of CUNY, again, City University in New York City, 25 campuses. It's huge. It enrolls 250,000 students at any given time. So it's a beast, much like UCLA, but a little bit different in terms of kind of who CUNY students are. A huge percentage of CUNY students are living very close to the federal poverty line in terms of their family income. So if we think about who queer CUNY is, I would say it's thousands of students potentially. And just to again frame this issue in terms of a larger lens, the right to privacy, which obviously currently is having its own battle separate to this. So the right to privacy has been raised as a legal framework in which to understand the rights of trans students. So this is a screenshot from the Campaign for Southern Equality, did a successful campaign in North Carolina where they were able to get high schools in the school districts to adopt a different way of doing records management where the preferred name was actually included in all public high school records. Their argument was that this is a right to privacy issue stemming from FERPA. This is very radical. So this just happened last year. And in their interpretation, it was a privacy violation to actually reveal the legal name. So I share that because I think it's an issue that has a lot of different ways you can kind of slice it. But these are just a couple of quotes from CUNY students who were dealing actively with this issue. So one of them said, hey, I'm actually scared to come to campus because when they come to campus and they show their ID and it has a different name that perhaps suggests a different gender, that public safety guard is saying, this isn't you, or they're getting into an altercation at that point. A lot of these quotes are very emotional, pronouns are disrespected, often ignored by someone who doesn't look at you as a person. And it feels like we're speaking into a void. And again, you can see this quote is only from last year. So we had a long road to dealing with these issues at CUNY. And a lot of this has to do with very common kind of universal issues, such as the general lack of awareness, bureaucracy, staff are not aware. CUNY is very big, so there's a lot of bureaucracy, and preferred names have typically been handled on a security side. So we actually have an Office of Identity Management. So there's an IT aspect, there's public safety, there's manifesting through class rosters. And again, it's really different than pronouns because we're getting into the distinction between what is legally correct and what is kind of honoring a sense of self and identity. So right now, we did have progress, and we do have a clear guideline on this website, which is, again, just from last year, put onto the cuny.edu webpage, which is really significant change. So I would just encourage folks at their own institutions to think about, can I find this information? Is it clear? Can queer students actually find any way to navigate? I wanted to share a little bit of the activism that led to this. So in 2014, there started to be kind of some general recommendations. This is an article about improving law school. And perhaps by no surprise, CUNY law is actually way ahead of the rest of the campuses in terms of adopting preferred names, perhaps because they know that it is actually a legal issue. So New York City legal guidance does include preferred names and pronouns, and it does apply to higher ed. Also, the Gender Recognition Act, which is very recent, has established things that are basically about to happen, which is that you can add all these different checkboxes to your driver's license or your state ID. You don't need all this documentation to change your gender, etc. So just an interesting kind of paradigm shift that I think we're seeing perhaps state by state at this point instead of a national direction. At CUNY, they chose to address this issue very top down. So they put out a memo. They said, hey, this is what's happening. And perhaps to no surprise, some follow-up was required. So I'm just going to kind of go quickly through these slides because I want to get to the student activism part. But essentially, there was an attempt to state, yes, you do not need a documentation. Okay, we're in line with the law. 2019, they put out another memo. Why do we need all these memos? Perhaps because it was not really working. So at this point, this slide is actually from a presentation that I was involved with to try to connect the different offices on this issue, because there was still a lot of gaps in terms of the student experience, and documentation was really not available. So let me skip forward a little. But the primary issue here is just that with legal name, it does have to be consistent on financial aid for your federal loans and also for employees. But there are ways to work with this issue clearly. These are all the different CUNY specific kind of platforms that are affected and impacted. And again, at your institution, you may have the same situation, physical mailing address. There's a lot of different ways we address students, and students might want that choice because maybe they're not out at home. Maybe they don't want their parents to know that they go by a completely different name at school. So there's complexity. Other institutions have handled this very differently. So for example, UCLA has this whole kind of breakdown, even down to trans health and medical services. So I would call some of this best practices. So to kind of end with student activism, which I think is just really important because this is really a student-driven issue. So at Hunter College, which is in Upper Manhattan on 68th Street, you know, you get these kind of op-eds. So this is a student writing in an online publication in a general sense. And I think because they address the general administration, as we all know, working perhaps in our own institutions, that might not be the greatest approach. You really need to be super specific, but it did start getting the word out there. Many more different efforts on different slices of this issue, all gender bathrooms. Preferred names in Blackboard happened. Okay, we're making some progress. Then there were a series of town halls in person. Main point here is that they started to bring in the Committee on Higher Education from the City Council, as well as the New York City Commission on Human Rights, because this is actually at this point a legal violation, and it's 2019. At a City Council hearing, students talked of a lot of these really unfortunate experiences that they were having. And again, this is public record comments that appeared in a publication online, being asked aggressively, you know, kind of personal questions. And it really does put that responsibility on the students to change the culture, where I think we could perhaps all agree that's not ideal. Lastly, there were efforts to kind of move forward some of these different bills, and they have had a lot of kind of different traction in New York City. So this one finally passed in 2019, but it was fought for 16 years. It's a very live issue. One faculty member is currently in an open lawsuit against the school. Some of these issues were picked up by the National Women's Studies Association and also the Center for LGBTQ Studies, CLAGS, which I'm involved with, which is based at the Graduate Center at CUNY. Again, the human rights focus is really unaddressed. In 2020, and I'm kind of wrapping up here, but we have again this issue at CUNY where a student had to file a Title IX complaint because he was alleged that he was personally targeted by an administrator who then took retaliative action against him and actually changed all of his accounts back to his legal name because of this administrator's personal beliefs, allegedly. So finally, we did have some forward movement. So most of that happened through an LGBTQ council that was founded in 2019. This was the first university-wide body that actually addressed any queer issues at CUNY. And again, with 25 campuses spread over 5 boroughs, they're physically and geographically separate. I would really encourage just folks to think about how could this kind of approach work at your institution, maybe it's a singular place, but how do you really know that these things are being followed up on? So finally in 2022, after 8 years of efforts, including a Title IX complaint, city council advocacy, 2 town halls, a lawsuit, a lot of different things, that is all the things that led to the singular page being added onto the university website. So everything's clear now. We do have the guidelines. There are still violations, but at least students can point to this and say, yes, CUNY affirms and honors my preferred name. And IT created this form. So just to completely wrap up, if you are at a different institution and you want to kind of touch base on this issue, feel free to reach out. But the most important thing always is just to listen to queer students. That's the takeaway. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for some absolutely amazing work at CUNY, and of course, happy to see University of Rochester, my alma mater, there. So everyone can see my page? Perfect. So my title is Screw Heteronorms, Moving Away from Heteronormativity and Cisnormativity in Supporting Queer Clients. So my name is Seth Meyer. I am an assistant professor at Bridgewater State University. There's my email, my Twitter handle, and anyone who knows me knows I love titles that catch you. So I am studying how nonprofits can support queer people in a queer manner. And what that means is oftentimes when we look at gay people, we say they're like straight people, only gay or bisexual. Trans people are like cisgendered people, only trans. But there are a lot of cultural aspects to the LGBTQIA community that get lost. And what that leads to is people don't always in nonprofits get the services and supports they need, not just LGBTQIA people, but also straight and cisgender people as well. So furthermore, LGBTQIA studies communities are missing from nonprofit and public administration. This has been something that's been talked about both publicly in some work I've done in Sam Larson and Elizabeth Dale and Nicole Elias, and also just privately amongst LGBTQIA people in PA. There's been some great works. Wallace Swan, who's here, has done some really amazing work, but we still have a long way to go. LGBTQIA individuals are often understood through heteronormative lens, as I mentioned earlier. And LGBTQIA plus identities, especially trans identities, sometimes just get ignored. Sometimes nonprofits will say, we focus on homelessness. We're not really focusing on trans identities, even though transness has a lot to do connected to homelessness. So moving forward. So I don't use queer theory. I use queer theory-esque in this article. Queer theory is a critical theory exploring sex and gender norms and hierarchies. It's a very big umbrella and explores how norms such as heterosexuality are privileged and used to control interactions in organizations. Queer theory questions binaries and identities sees them as fluid. The reason this is queer theory-esque is because this is a survey with binary questions. So it can't really be fully queer theory, but queer theory is informing my research, and especially heteronormativity, which is really the main theoretical framework I'm using. And connected to this is also cisnormativity. So heteronormativity is when heterosexuality or straightness is the norm, and anything else is seen as the other. Heteronormativity is power structures. Especially within nonprofits, which is my area of expertise and interest. This is through the expectation of traditional family structures, expecting people to be in a nuclear family or in married couples, where some research has shown that LGBTQIA individuals often have open relationships or polyamorous relationships sometimes. And also have non-familial, non-biological families. Anyone who's familiar with drag, you can see this in drag families. Furthermore, there's the expectation that all people share similar life goals, such as having a family, having a child or a 40-hour a weak job. And not everyone does. And there's also the expectation that every person has a very clear and discrete gender, but gender is complicated. And actually, for me, as someone who's Jewish, it's always interesting to hear this two gender thing, because in Judaism, we've got, depending on who you ask, 6 to 9 different genders. So, and that's just what's considered a Western religion, but in many different religions, many different cultures, gender is complicated. So my study is exploring how nonprofits, there we go. First of all, the basic question: what is the LGBTQIA plus experience within nonprofits? And what are best practices which nonprofits are using? What have nonprofits done that are positive? And what can nonprofits do better? My last question is really, how can we support LGBTQIA plus individuals in a queer manner? Instead of saying, you're gay, so you're like straight, only a little bit different, saying you're queer, so you're part of this community. How can we provide services that support you and your needs connected to this community? So I am doing a survey of LGBTQIA plus individuals, 18 plus in the United States. And it asks about nonprofit use, experiences, how nonprofits can be done better. I also ask a lot of questions around sex work, HIV/AIDS, relationship status, and how all of those interact with your nonprofit use. So far, there are 68 usable responses so far. I did apply for an NSF grant, and yesterday I did get rejected, so yay. I'm going to reapply, and I have a very dark sense of humor about all of this. But I am always looking for kind of how to expand this. And of course, like any big research study, slow moving, but I'm excited about what I have so far. So first, the good news. A lot of people really are saying that they have felt unwelcome in nonprofits. Now, that's good, but part of that also means that queer people have done a really good job in finding the nonprofits that can meet their needs. One thing that I find interesting as someone who's more religious is most people going to houses of worship do not explicitly go to an LGBTQIA plus house of worship, although they are still looking for a house of worship with a large queer population. And especially in Judaism, but also in a lot of other religions, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of really queer-focused houses of worship popped up. And so what we're seeing is now LGBTQ people, IA people don't really need that as much, but they're still looking for large queer populations, obviously. Many people reported open and polyamorous relationships, as well as having queer non-biological families. And what that means is that that needs to be added in. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means now. To the question of how can nonprofits make you feel more welcoming? One of the big things that was responded to is validating bisexuality. And even validating heterosexuality. When I was doing this, one of the IRB responses was, how can someone be straight? It's like, well, a transgender person can be straight. They're still part of the LGBTQIA community. But also, especially with bisexuality, if someone's bisexual and in an opposite gender relationship, they're still bisexual, and kind of going beyond just this hetero-homo binary and helping organizations understand that. More queer leaders, identification of queer allies, and building on what Elvis was talking about earlier, declaration of pronouns. Open and non-judgmental discussion of sexual history during STI screenings. This is a very big thing. And one of the things that does prevent LGBTQIA, especially male gay and male bisexual people from going for STI screenings, is judgment on how many sexual partners they have. And as designation of individuals non-biologically related as immediate family. Mindful of terminology. And helping people feel normal. And again, supporting open relationships, putting pro-GLBT messaging on their web page or rainbow flag. One of the things I'm also seeing is, pride is wonderful, but you often see nonprofits say, we love gays for 1 month of the year. So having this more loving gays for 12 months of the year is even better. Having people who are part of the community visible, and the ability to use they. And and also utilizing they more, allowing for the they pronouns as well as other pronouns that people utilize rather than just he, she. So that's just a very basic introduction. I'm going to be continuing outreach. I'm applying for grants. And what I hope to do from all of this is build up best practices from this work so that nonprofits can really explore ways that they can better support LGBTQIA individuals. So I now present you with a QR code, and if you click it, you'll actually find my survey. So please, feel free to take a picture of this if you identify as someone in the LGBTQIA plus community. Please feel free to share it with all of your friends. I know everyone, whenever you text your friends, all you say is, I found this great survey. That's what me and my friends do. And if you have any questions, this is, of course, my email address and my Twitter. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. And I see there's a lot of chat. And yes, thank you so much for liking my dark sense of humor. So I will open it up for questions if anyone has any. I've got a bunch because I'm me. But I also do want to open it up for questions if anyone has any. Oh, and thank you, Maurice. Sorry, Elvis.
Seth, you didn't say anything about your book that you published.
I did not, but I will put up. Thank you, Maurice knows me, and Maurice spoils me. I do have a new book coming out, and Maurice is one of the authors on social equity and how to teach social equity, and it's all a bunch of case studies, and it's really just fantastic. And I will put a link to it in the. It is coming out soon in paperback, and I should be getting my copy soon. So should you, Maurice. But it's all about lessons in social equity and how to teach social equity with case studies. And Elvis, I'm also happy to send you an email later with some resources on the different genders. And I'll even send you an article that I have, an R&R in, that actually talks about this a little bit more, but I'm always happy to talk about Judaism. Are there questions? So Ignacio, I was really interested by your discussion on the issues, and you started talking about this, but I'm curious, what museums are doing queer art well, and especially queer art that maybe is non-Western queerness, or as Elvis was discussing, queerness focusing on female and transgender individuals?
I don't think we're there yet. I think things are changing. I've noticed how, and I'm talking about in the last 2 years, this is not like in the last decade, how you go to museums and all of a sudden, for instance, I went to the Santa Barbara Museum, and they acknowledged that Marston Hartley was queer, and they talked about it and I was very impressed because it's the first time. So I'm beginning to see little steps in that area. There's also the fact that now museums are doing shows on LGBTQ artists, like the Tate did, and it's becoming, I mean, they've done it in Berlin, in Spain, in Taiwan, so that is becoming a thing as well. So that is becoming. And in regards to female artists, I haven't seen that as a trend yet. And but I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen because, diversity is now happening everywhere, and that's probably the next frontier. And I think it's going to start happening very, very soon.
Thank you. Maurice had a question for me. What characteristics of nonprofits am I studying? So I'm studying generally what nonprofits people interact with, and I have a list of about 20 on my survey. But I'm also especially interested in sports clubs, homeless shelters, and houses of worship. Part of that is, outside of this, I'm actually an MMA fighter. I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai, Krav. And so I am always the only gay guy there. And so I'm always very, I have a big international group of people, and we always talk about, how to be safe in BJJ. So I'm always curious about how people interact with sports clubs. Homeless shelters is a very big issue. Homelessness is still very prominent in the LGBTQIA plus community, especially in the trans community. So, and in the trans community, we also see a lot more discrimination because of an expected gender binary. So I really want to see what we can do better for homeless shelters. It's not answering this big question of homelessness, but it's at least making it a little bit better. And houses of worship, again, as someone who's religious, something that just really fascinates me. And we always hear about homophobia in the religious community, but there's also a lot of work that's being done to promote acceptance. And I think that it's really great to explore how can we make these more places, houses of worship, more accepting. And of course, so that's kind of three types of nonprofits I'm looking at, but I'm also asking in general, especially health clinics. Thank you. Elvis, one question I had for you is, so you've talked about a lot of these macro issues, but I'm selfish. I want to know what I can do. So as a professor in a big institution who doesn't really have much power yet, eventually, what can I do to support my transgender students, especially around names, pronouns? How can I work within the system?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think if it wasn't even clear, I'm a very in the system type of person. So I think that's, kind of ironic because all this change really needed the university LGBTQ council to happen. So we had all these activism, all the pushing, and then it kind of clicked. But yeah, so individually, I think the main thing really is listening, because people, this issue particularly, and issues in general that hit, this much smaller population of trans and gender non-conforming students, you may have one student, right, who identifies as trans and has this issue. And I think it's so easy for that person to get lost in a bigger system if no one's like, hey, I do actually care and I'm going to take action on your issue right now. That was kind of what happened at CUNY. It's a very big system, so it's that bureaucracy thing. But for you personally, yeah, I mean, just could you even answer these questions at your institution? That's what I would challenge folks to say. Hey, is there like documentation? Is there a council? Is there some body or person who I would personally go to that you feel comfortable reaching out to? So yeah, all of this happened very in the system, ironically. Yeah, Maurice, did you want to jump into that?
I just wanted to follow up on Seth's question, because as you talked about the CUNY system, of course, I live in New York City and I attended a couple of those forums at the Graduate Center. So my question for you, specifically, what you've identified in terms of some of the problems, do you see that more at the undergrad level, or what are you seeing at the graduate level of the CUNY systems? And is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a huge difference. Yeah, and I don't even know how to exactly put my finger on it, but yes, the graduate schools, maybe because you're dealing with adults, you're dealing with doctoral students, they're much more likely to, be the more activist-y side. And I think there's a level of education and feeling of entitlement to make that active action happen, where, again, being adults. Because yeah, CUNY Law, Journalism School, Graduate Center, these are all much better about these issues. I think undergraduates tend to feel disempowered. They're young. I've had the experience personally of having HR say, no, this is completely crazy. You're crazy, this issue, you're wrong. You can't get your name on an ID like this. I mean, this is the type of comments that are pretty common. So for an undergraduate who's like 18 years old, they just may feel the system is against them. A lot of things in New York City already feel like that. And then they walk away and that's it. So yeah, there's not a lot of cohesive student undergraduate activism around queer issues at CUNY right now. Not to say there hasn't been in the past, but at least at the Graduate Center, it's quite different, much better, basically.
I was going to also add that the Ford Foundation funded through the CLAGS project that Dr. Battle's working on and won, and that he's working with, is archive based, but there's connecting colleges and universities throughout the country. There's been, I think, 3 years now in the study to kind of examine how we can LGBTQIA can tell our story and sort of uplift these stories. So I'm not sure if you're connected with him, but I certainly could. I think that would be a key resource in some of the because I do think he's a champion of these issues within the CUNY system.
Definitely, yes, I'm familiar with his work, and it's great. And yeah, there's so much amazing things that happen at CUNY, on queer issues. So I think this is where this was a very insular bureaucratic issue, and faculty alone didn't really have the ability. So a lot of the people involved in this council are like counselors, social workers, mental health folks, and faculty, but it's a real alliance that has to go deeper than only what faculty can do, if that makes sense. But yeah, that's totally great. Juan Battle, awesome person. Thank you.
Seth, I want to add one thing to your question before about museums, etc., which I thought about later. I've noticed a huge increase in of presence of LGBTQ artists, male, female, transgender, all kinds in our galleries. And that is becoming a huge deal because in time, they reach a level of awareness that take them to museums. Like the Whitney did an exhibition earlier this year on the Solomon Tour, a queer artist who, started in galleries and now he's at the Whitney. And so that's something that I think is very promising. And I also mentioned how the whole thing about Jasper Jones and Rauschenberg was not addressed until last year's exhibition at the Whitney and the Philadelphia Museum. And it's because the curator was queer. And so that's, I think, it's an interesting factor in that as more queer curators get into museums, we're going to see more of that. So I just wanted to add these two little caveats to what I said before.
That's a great point. And I'd like to point out also in the chat, there's some great comments, especially about the use of safe space and safe space trainings, which for those of you not aware is a training where you go and every university does it very differently, but at the end you get a little sticker or some sort of thing to put on your door to show that you are a safe space for LGBTQIA individuals. So that is always a great thing. And I think many, many universities do have that, I believe. So. Other questions or comments?
Yes, I had one.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at LGBTQ nonprofits? I think it might be kind of interesting to see what kinds of reactions you get there, because I see a lot of conflict between the older generation that's running them and the people who are younger and new employees, and there is really a lot of conflict going on there. So I just thought I might mention that to you.
I am very interested in that. I mean, I'm from New York, and I know the Pride Center has had to deal a lot with that. And also I now live in Boston, and anyone who follows the Pride parades in Boston, they decided actually to shut down the organization that run the Pride Parade instead of dealing with the inherent racism within the organization. So I'm very interested in a lot of that. And one of the next steps of this, and another study Jody Benenson and I are doing, is we actually really want to look at intersectional LGBTQIA organizations, and specifically gay Jewish organizations, and how they really support LGBTQIA individuals. But there is also generational differences, and I'm actually been reaching out to LGBTQIA nonprofits, asking them to distribute the survey, and I've gotten some really wonderful responses, and it's been really exciting to work with some of these nonprofits.
Seth, that's interesting, and Wally, it's a really interesting question. The LGBT organization that does the Pride in New York City actually last year almost went to blows and disbanded to not hire a person of color. So that happened last year. I wanted to just kind of mention to Ignacio, and thinking about the National Endowment for the Art and Jesse Helms, and during that time period, you know, you mentioned Mapplethorpe, but there was also Marlon Riggs and Tongues Untied, the video that was funded by the National Endowment of the Arts, and was part of the, you know, sort of the political underbelly, you know, that for those 20 years where you mentioned that there was not much funding happening for you know, a queer organization or queer artists because of the sort of the political environment right during right at the sort of the arc, the beginning of the arc of HIV and AIDS in this country, that there was just so much hate and fear directed at, you know, specific communities, communities of color and gay men, you know, and so there were just people were running away from trying to fund or anything that would look like support to these specific organizations. So I just wanted to add that in terms of the context of what you talked about earlier.
Can I make a response as well?
Oh, please, Elvis.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think I just wanted to kind of highlight in the thoughts in the chat, you know, it's a really different story. Like when you kind of look at it by gender, you know, women in our world have had such a completely different trajectory. I guess the main thing is just, you know, speaking about the present, you know, I do notice like women artists are more frequently acknowledged by museums now. So Alice Austin, there's an Alice Austin house on Staten Island. It's a whole museum devoted to a woman who was with another woman for 50 years. So only last year did they decide this was a relationship, you know. So it's happening. But I think just the trajectory of all the activity on a low level, on the micro level, it doesn't translate to museums over time for women. It does not. So that's the main issue. So I just wanted to put it on the record. Thank you.
For sure. In one of my lectures, I talk about that, the history of a female artist, LGBT artists, or queer artists throughout history, and it's fascinating. And I talk about Alice Austin among many others. And but it is true that they are underrepresented for many different reasons. But as I mentioned before, in our galleries, that is changing dramatically. I've seen so many new exhibitions, and you know, that's gonna reach critical mass, and that's gonna go to museums. It's gonna happen.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has, or a couple more comments, if anyone has anything.
Well, just one last comment, Seth, and the shifting of the guards. I mean, the Guggenheim just got its first Black woman curator 2 years ago. So there is a slowly shifting.
It's happening.
You know.
Yeah.
Oh, the
Curators are the gatekeepers, you know. But like I mentioned in the presentation, there is a challenge. They do have a challenge, which is the board of directors of museums, which are very conservative, and they're all about, you know, not ruffling feathers. So that's the challenge they're facing.
We were just sent the 2-minute mark. So I just want to end as the moderator to say thank you so much to Elvis and Ignacio for really a wonderful and diverse session. It was really fascinating to see how queerness can be seen in so many different lights. So thank you to both of you. Thank you everyone who came. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to continue on these conversations.
Thank you.
All right, and Tommy, we can